August 20th, 1944. Near Brest, Brittany, the night lay heavy with mist. German sentries listened from the hedgerows. What reached them was a layered soundscape, an engine dropping a gear, brush snapping under tracks, the steady throb of idling machinery. It seemed to come from everywhere. A corporal reported tanks assembling. Another swore a column stretched beyond the fields. By dawn, binoculars showed what ears had promised. Smoke from cook fires, tire marks in wet soil, the bustle of a bivouac. It sounded real, but nothing was there. The arrival had been conjured by Allied half-tracks, blasting recordings from magnetic wire reels. The U.S. Army called the parent unit the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. History remembers it as the Ghost Army. Within it, the 3132nd Signal Service Company, Special, handled sound. Their mission was simple to state and hard to execute. Make the enemy hear what isn't there and believe it. At Pine Camp's Army Experimental Station in New York, soldiers trained with engineers from Bell Labs. They built a library of authentic battlefield audio on wire recorders. Shermans, trucks, half-tracks, bulldozers, even voices barking orders. They learned how weather and terrain bent sound and used a mobile weather station to set volume and direction for each mission. What made the system effective was scale and choreography. 500-pound loudspeakers mounted on half-tracks could project miles of sound, but volume alone fooled no one. Crews mixed recordings like a score, a lone tank, then another, then a rising swell until the night hummed with a notional battalion. Chains clinked, engines idled, steel rang. The mind filled in the rest. At Brest, this deception played out under fire for the first time. From 10:30 p.m., 5 half-tracks staged the arrival of 3 tank companies, while inflatable armor and camp details sold the picture by day. Some nearby Americans thought reinforcements had come. German gunners shelled the fake positions, a sign the ruse had taken hold. Deception carried risk. When the Ghost Army simulated an artillery line, German batteries replied with real barrages. The unit took casualties. 3 men killed across the campaign. Their craft saved lives but drew fire. The weapon was psychology. A watcher in a tower had scraps, an engine note in damp air, a rumor from HQ, a faint glow. His question was not, is this a recording, but how many tanks and when? Plausibility did the rest. By March 1945, the method was refined. In Operation Viersen on the Rhine, the Ghost Army staged the arrival of 2 divisions with rubber armor, fake radio nets, and thunderous convoys. German commanders shifted forces to face phantoms. The 9th Army crossed elsewhere with little resistance. Noise paved the way for silence. Behind each success sat discipline, weather checks, careful splices to suggest weakness, cutting generators minutes before a fake arrival. Unglamorous work, but it made illusions breathe. The Allies' sound trucks never shattered walls. They shattered certainty, forcing staffs to doubt maps, question scouts, and spend shells on ghosts. At Brest, they bent the defense. At the Rhine, they opened the way. And on every damp night where a German ear strained through the dark, they proved that what you hear is not always what is true. February 1944. Pine Camp, upstate New York. Snow crusted the parade ground, muffling boots and tires. Most soldiers trained as usual. But behind a row of wooden barracks, something different was happening. Inside, men bent over wire recorders. Microphones dangled from rafters. Half-tracks idled outside. This was no gunnery drill. It was rehearsal for deception. The 3132nd Signal Service Company knew their task was not ordinary. They would not win battles with firepower, but with illusion. The Army had drawn them from many trades: radio operators, engineers, stage designers, even musicians. One private had set microphones in a New York studio. Another had drummed in a swing band. Now they learned to make an armored division appear from thin air. At Pine Camp, they built the Sonic Library. Technicians from Bell Labs arrived with magnetic wire recorders, the newest technology still unknown to civilians. Each reel held about 20 minutes. enough to capture a convoy grinding into position. Crews recorded a Sherman idling, then revving, then shifting gears. They caught treads biting into frozen ruts, trucks on inclines, bulldozers clearing snow. Voices too, sergeants barking orders, guides shouting, the low chatter of men. Each reel was boxed, labeled, and added to the arsenal. The trick was layering. A sergeant explained it like music. One tank is a trumpet, two are harmony. A company is the whole band. The soldiers began to think like composers. They built scores where engines entered in sequence. Voices shouted at intervals. Chains rattled like equipment unloading. They placed silences with care. Too much perfection betrayed the ruse. Even in training, the effect unsettled. One evening, the company staged a test for visiting officers. 3 half-tracks lined a ridge with loudspeakers. At dusk, they played the arrival of a tank battalion. From the valley, it sounded as if iron rolled down the hill. The roar deepened, spread, moved from one speaker to the next. Men swore they could almost see headlights in the dark. Officers peered through binoculars to confirm what they heard. Many left convinced. Approval meant pressure. Timing had to be exact. A truck shifting too late ruined the illusion. A voice clipped too short gave it away. The men drilled in the cold, splicing wire with stiff fingers, hauling speakers through snow. Discipline was strict. The sounds had to live. Daily life mixed routine and strange creativity. Mornings began with drill. Afternoons dissolved into hours of splicing and playback. The barracks smelled of solder, grease, hot metal. Reels stacked high carried labels. Tank idle, light snow, trucks, 10 vehicles, dirt road, voices distant. To outsiders, it looked absurd. To the men, it was an arsenal. Secrecy weighed on them. Letters home said nothing. Families pictured trenches or guard posts, never deception labs. On leave in Watertown, the men laughed about their odd works. "We make noise," one private joked, "and the Army pays us." They knew the truth. The stakes were deadly serious. With spring, snow melted. Training shifted outdoors. Sound carried differently in damp air across fields along valleys. Crews learned to angle loudspeakers, mask hum with birdsong, calculate how long sound took to reach a distant ear. In mock battles, one group played Germans, tasked with spotting the trick. Time after time, even knowing the game, they were fooled. The company learned how fragile perception could be. The hardest lesson was that sound alone rarely sufficed. If trucks roared but no tire tracks showed, suspicion grew. So the sonic unit worked with camouflage teams, rubber tanks, dummy artillery, even laundry lines. Illusion became a full body. Sound was the heartbeat. Dummies were the flesh. Together, they created life. By midsummer, the company was ready. They had their library, their doctrine, and a reputation as the men with the ghosts. Soon their recordings would leave the snows of New York and thunder across France. Few imagined how close to fire they would have to bring their machines, or how real their illusions would feel. June 1944, Normandy. Hedgerows heavy with leaves, fields scarred by bombardment. American convoys crawled inland, roads jammed with trucks, jeeps, tanks. Hidden among them was a detachment few recognized, the Sonic Company. Their olive-drab trucks carried racks of loudspeakers, reels of wire packed like ammunition. They wore the same helmets, but their weapon was illusion. The first field trial was modest. Commanders wanted to see if sound alone could alter German expectations. A village lay ahead, with enemy forces near a crossroads. If they believed armor was massing on the flank, they might withdraw. At dusk, the sonic crews unrolled cables, pointed speakers through hedgerows, and pressed play. Engines rumbled. Trucks ground into position. Sergeants shouted. The sequence rose and fell like a living unit. To farmhouses nearby, it must have sounded as if an armored column had arrived. German patrols reported mechanized movement of at least battalion strength. By morning, the area was empty. No firefight, no loss of life. Only the faint smell of diesel from a generator. Word spread fast. Officers began to call them ghost units. But success meant risk. The Germans were not fools. They counted tracks, watched horizons. If the trick failed, men could die. Orders pushed the sonic troops closer to the front. In August, during the breakout from St. Lo, the 3192nd mounted speakers on half-tracks and crept within a mile of German lines. Hedgerows carried the sound forward. This time the score was complex. Tanks clanking on pontoon bridges, engineers shouting, trucks unloading, bulldozers clearing ground. Reconnaissance reports soon warned of bridging equipment massing south of town. German reserves shifted. The real U.S. divisions punched through elsewhere. For the sound crews, strain was constant. Reels had to start on cue, wires spliced in darkness, generators kept alive in damp air. More than once, shells landed close enough to shower them with dirt. They were soldiers first, technicians second. Their lives depended on illusion, but their deaths could come from very real fire. One private recalled crouching behind a half-track, clutching a reel as shrapnel rattled on the armor. "I thought, what a fool's way to die, hugging a recording of a truck while the real ones rolled past." He lived and the sound played on. The psychological effect was strong. Prisoners later swore they had faced multiple divisions when they had heard only speakers. One officer admitted ordering artillery against armor that never existed. Shells fell on empty fields. Ammunition wasted. Morale shaken. Noise itself had become a weapon. The sonic men developed a rhythm. They arrived at night, set up under nets, chose reels like ammunition. Convoy arrival, bridge building, armor assembly. At 0 hour, the sounds began. Before dawn, they packed up, leaving only tracks in the soil and the echo of an army that never was. By autumn, the deceptions grew bolder. Entire regiments appeared by sound. Infantry fought harder with the roar of tanks behind them. German observers, unsure of what they faced, delayed attacks. Confusion spread, and confusion killed. Yet doubt remained. What if the enemy caught on? What if they learned the thunder of a division came from 3 trucks and a few reels? The sonic men rehearsed endlessly to avoid slips. They trained to deploy in minutes, as quickly as a gun crew. They were soldiers of illusion, fighting battles of nerves as real as any at the front. Civilians glimpsed them and wondered. French villagers spoke of trucks that came in silence and left only phantom noise. Some children thought they were musicians. In a way, they were, but their stage was war, and their audience the enemy. By late 1944, sonic deception was no experiment. It was a weapon. German officers read reports of American strength that existed only on tape. Every bullet not fired, every soldier saved because the enemy fought ghosts, was proof that the craft had earned its place. December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow-bent pine branches, low, muffling sound, cloaking movement. The German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, hit like a thunderclap. Allied roads clogged with retreating units, command posts scattered. Amid this chaos, the sonic companies received their hardest orders yet. Make weakness look like strength. They were told to mask withdrawals, to conjure reinforcements where none existed. Not just a tank company, but the hum of an army. Outside Bastogne, loudspeakers hung between trees, cables buried in snow. Generators coughed in the cold. Then the reels spun. Trucks rumbled, engines revved, orders barked. Even the clink of mess kits was layered in. German patrols listening through the night believed fresh corps had arrived. In truth, only a few battered units held the line. The strain was immense. Crews worked under blackout, hiding gear under nets and pine boughs. Shells sometimes burst in nearby clearings. "You felt invisible," one corporal recalled, "but you knew you were louder than anyone else on the front." Their noise could save lives or draw fire onto their own heads. The deception broadened. Camouflage teams rolled out inflatables, logs painted as artillery, campfires built to match the scale of a regiment. Engineers dragged branches behind jeeps to mimic tank tracks. Radio crews filled the air with false chatter. It became full-spectrum theater, and it worked. Prisoners later told interrogators they had halted attacks, convinced American reinforcements were already in position. Those hours of hesitation gave the real divisions time to regroup. In the Ardennes, minutes meant survival. Ghosts bought them. The cold tested the technology. Wire grew brittle. Snow swallowed sound. Crews adapted. Speakers angled toward valleys. Frozen hillsides used as amplifiers. In winter silence, even a jeep grinding gears could be magnified into the groan of armor. Life in the sonic unit was harsh. Nights stringing wires, days huddled in trucks, fingers numb on reels. Meals often cold rations gulped between setups. Yet there was pride. We were strange soldiers, one GI wrote, armed with recordings instead of rifles. But the enemy reacted to us just the same. At times, even friendly troops were fooled. Some Americans, hearing the roar of phantom convoys, believed relief had come sooner than it had. Confusion spread both ways, a measure of how real the deception could sound. By the end of the bulge, the sonic men had a reputation. No longer an experiment, but specialists in deception. Each time they were called forward, they carried their arsenal of sound deeper into enemy ground. March 1945. The Rhine lay wide and cold under a pale spring sky. German commanders swore it could not be crossed. The Allies thought otherwise. To break through, they turned again to deception. North of the real crossings, the sonic units staged their boldest show. Loudspeakers hidden in reeds blasted the grind of bulldozers, the hammer of pontoon planks, the shouts of engineers. Trucks arrived through recordings made weeks before. Generators hummed as reels spun, projecting the labor of a phantom army. At dawn, German spotters reported frantic bridge building. Artillery batteries shifted and unleashed fire on empty water. Shells churned spray, scattering fish and smoke across deserted banks. Meanwhile, real bridges rose elsewhere, girders locking into place. By the time the mistake was clear, American infantry were already across. The deception used more than sound. Inflatable boats bobbed in eddies. Painted logs stood as guns. Smoke covered open ground. But the core of the trick was audio. One engineer later admitted that even he half believed the bridge when he heard it over the speakers. This was the zenith of sonic deception. By 1945, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, later called the Ghost Army, worked like a symphony. Rubber Shermans under nets, false radio traffic, and from the sound crews, the orchestra of war, convoys, armor, shouted commands. Together, they conjured the weight of divisions that never existed. German reports betrayed the confusion. Officers complained of phantom units shifting along the Rhine. One wrote bitterly that Americans seemed to multiply overnight. In truth, they were hearing wire reels spun from trucks hidden in woods. For the sound men, the nights were perilous. Speakers had to be close to the river to project across, well within reach of German guns. Shells sometimes found them. Crews scrambled for cover, then crawled back, reconnected wires, restarted reels. Phantom battalions rolled on. The effect was measurable. Thousands of shells wasted. Divisions moved in the wrong direction. Hours gained for the real bridgeheads. The Rhine, called the Reich's final barrier, fell not only to steel and blood, but also to deception. Veterans later spoke of those nights with awe. They had not stormed bunkers. They had stood in mud, broadcasting illusions that altered operations. We weren't the ones crossing, one said, but our noise gave them time. By the end of March, the Rhine was breached on a broad front. German defenses collapsed. The sonic men packed their reels and speakers for one last push, eastward, into the heart of a dying Reich. April 1945. The Reich was collapsing. Bridges lay shattered, cities burned. Roads filled with surrendering soldiers and fleeing civilians. Yet the German army could still resist, and American commanders wanted every edge. Once again, the deception units were called. The sound companies rolled east in convoys of battered trucks. Loudspeakers bore scars of shrapnel. Reels carried scratches from months of use. But the library of sound had grown. Not only tanks and trucks, but the hiss of field kitchens, the squeak of artillery, even the hollow echo of boots on bridges. Every detail mattered. In these final weeks, they were asked to conjure whole armies from nothing. Near Leipzig, the mission was to suggest 2 divisions massing north of the city, while the real attack came from the west. At dusk, sound crews parked half-tracks in wooded hollows. Generators sputtered. Then the roar began. Engines shifted gears, orders rang out, metal clattered. German patrols reported heavy mechanized traffic. Within hours, defenses shifted north, exactly as planned. The ruse was reinforced. Inflatable Shermans crouched under nets. Logs painted green posed as artillery. Fires glowed in pits. But it was the audio that gave life. Without the deep growl of engines, the trick would be hollow. With it, even veterans believed. For the operators, these nights were surreal. Headphones tight, reels spinning. They timed every layer like conductors. When German artillery barked at the phantom columns, the shells landed far away. We felt like ghosts ourselves, one soldier recalled. Everywhere and nowhere at once. East of Dresden, they staged perhaps their boldest play. Commanders wanted Germans to fear an armored corps moving south, cutting off retreat into Czechoslovakia. In reality, only reconnaissance units probed there. The sound crews hauled gear onto ridges. For 3 nights, valleys echoed with tank engines, grinding tracks, test-fired guns. German reports logged a corps that never existed. Reserves pulled south, leaving Dresden weaker against the real Western thrust. Prisoners later described the effect. They spoke of tanks in the night, of commanders convinced divisions hid in the forests. Some swore they had seen columns that were never there. Fear, suggestion, and fatigue blurred sound into sight. Discipline cracked. Units surrendered sooner. Life in the deception units was grueling. Wires frayed, speakers blew, reels warped in the damp. Crews scavenged constantly. Copper wire from German phones, parts from wrecks, cloth from barns. Every scrap kept the ruse alive. There were moments of irony. Once, while broadcasting a phantom column, a real armored unit rumbled into the same sector. For minutes, recordings and reality overlapped. A veteran later laughed, "At last, we were in stereo." By April's end, the Reich collapsed faster than expected. Hitler cowered in his bunker. Commanders surrendered whole armies. Refugees crowded the roads. For the sound companies, their strange war was nearly done. But their last missions near Leipzig and Dresden proved what deception could achieve. Not just noise, but hours and days of advantage, bought with wire, canvas, and nerve. May 1945. The Elbe River marked the line of convergence, where Americans and Soviets would meet. The Reich was collapsing, but chaos could still kill. Commanders feared ambushes, last-ditch counterattacks, or rogue units refusing to surrender. Once again, the sound companies were sent forward. Near Magdeburg, they staged one of their last ruses. The mission was to suggest that an armored division was preparing to cross the Elbe. Loudspeakers were hidden in brush along the riverbank. As night deepened, the water carried sound farther than wires could. Engines groaned. Artillery clanked into place. Bridging timbers rang out. To German ears, another crossing was certain. In truth, only fragments of American forces stood nearby. The deception applied pressure without bloodshed. German guns fired into the dark, shells bursting over empty meadows. By dawn, their lines had thinned, convinced the threat lay elsewhere. For the sonic crews, these final weeks felt anticlimactic. Months of risk and rehearsal had led to an enemy collapsing on its own. Yet orders were clear: keep the ghosts alive to the end. They drove battered trucks along ruined highways, past surrendering Germans and cheering civilians. At times, their illusion seemed unnecessary, but they knew one false clash could cost hundreds of lives. If noise prevented even a single firefight, it mattered. The meeting of Soviet and American troops at the Elbe was celebrated worldwide. The soundmen were nearby but unmentioned, their reels still humming. They were not photographed shaking hands. Their contribution remained unseen. After victory, secrecy closed in. Reports described their work in vague language. Families asked what they had done in the war. Some answered, "We made noise." Others kept silent, carrying memories of nights spent stringing cables in mud while shells burst overhead. Many wrestled with pride and doubt. They had not stormed beaches or raised flags, but they knew illusions had saved lives, confused the enemy, and opened paths for real divisions. "We were magicians in uniform," one veteran wrote. "Our trick was never to fool ourselves, only the enemy." Only decades later did the full story emerge. Declassified records revealed German units diverted by recordings, batteries wasted on phantom bridges, corps delayed by echoes. What had begun at Pine Camp as an experiment had become a real weapon of war. For the veterans, the Elbe lingered in memory. They recalled the smell of spring on the river, the cough of generators, the ghostly thunder of tanks that never were. They carried a quiet pride. Their battlefield was the mine, their weapon illusion, their victory silence where slaughter might have been. Summer 1945. The war was over. Europe lay in ruins. The soldiers of the sonic units, those ghost makers, returned quietly to American soil. There were no parades, no headlines. Their missions were stamped classified, their stories sealed away. They had conjured entire armies from nothing but recordings, amplifiers, and nerve. Yet few outside command ever knew their names. For the veterans, the transition was strange. Many had enlisted as ordinary signalmen. They ended the war as actors in a theater of deception. Back in civilian life, some went into advertising, others returned to studios, and many simply put their memories aside. But all carried the knowledge that they had fought on a battlefield of perception, not firepower. Army analysts later reviewed their reports. They traced how, in Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine, German forces diverted troops, fired barrages, or delayed assaults in response to phantom noise. Ammunition was wasted. Timetables collapsed. Initiative was lost. The conclusion was clear. Deception had saved lives. The method fascinated historians. Unlike propaganda, sonic deception was immediate. A German soldier did not need to read a leaflet or believe a rumor. He only needed to hear engines grinding through the night and report what he believed. Instinct did the rest. Some scholars later called these units precursors to Cold War psychological warfare. Their lessons, that imagination and technology could reshape a battlefield, echoed in later conflicts. False radio traffic in Korea, inflatable airfields during the Suez Crisis, electronic trickery in Vietnam. The thread of deception stretched forward. Recognition came late. In the 1980s and 1990s, their work was finally declassified. Books and films told the story of how sound and sight became weapons. Veterans met again, swapping stories of nights under fire, of reels spinning in the mud, of the time real tanks rolled in on top of a recording. They laughed, but there was pride. They had fought a war of shadows, and it had been real. One sergeant, interviewed near the end of his life, put it plainly. "We made the Germans chase ghosts. Every time they did, our boys lived. That's enough for me." The legacy of the sonic companies rests in that paradox. They fought without firing. They killed without killing. They left no shell craters, no bullet scars, but they left hesitation, confusion, paralysis, effects as decisive as artillery. Today, when planners speak of information warfare or shaping the battlefield, they echo lessons first tested by those men. The roar of phantom tanks in a Norman hedgerow, the clang of imaginary bridges over the Rhine, the ghostly convoys that rumbled through Saxony. All were part of a new kind of war. And for the veterans who lived it, memory survives not in metals, but in sound. The hiss of a reel in the dark, the hum of a generator, the sudden illusion of life where none existed. Their war is remembered in echoes, echoes of armies that never were, yet still changed history. Autumn 1945. The war had ended months earlier, yet the echoes of deception lingered. For the men who had carried reels and speakers across Europe, Life at home felt strangely muted. No phantom tanks, no midnight illusions. The battlefield noise was gone, but in their minds it remained. Many tried to return to normal lives. A few went back into music, their training shaping unexpected careers. One corporal opened a Chicago studio, explaining how acoustics could trick the ear. Another became a Broadway set designer, drawing on camouflage lessons once used to hide inflatable Shermans. A private from Brooklyn, who had layered the roar of engines, later mixed jazz records. He said he always thought of it as building an army of sound. Not all memories were creative. Some veterans spoke of nightmares in which columns still rumbled through the night. Others remembered the silence after missions, when speakers fell quiet and they realized there had never been an army at all. The silence was worse than the noise, one man admitted, because it reminded you that everything you made didn't exist. Historians would call them pioneers of psychological warfare. But their story revealed something larger: how fragile human perception is. In a century scarred by propaganda, these soldiers had shown how easily sound could shape belief. That lesson carried into post-war media, advertising, even politics. What began in the hedgerows of Normandy foreshadowed an age where perception itself became a battlefield. Civilians remembered, too. French villagers spoke of Americans who made noise but no battles. Some laughed, others felt awe. A farmer swore he lay awake as convoys passed unseen, certain the ground trembled, though no tank appeared. In Germany, captured officers confessed how unnerving it was to fight shadows. One colonel said bluntly, "We feared the Americans had found a way to multiply themselves." To many, U.S. power lay not only in industry, but also in imagination. For decades, their story stayed buried. Yet reunions kept memory alive. Old men played scratchy tapes of engines in VFW halls, smiling at the ghosts of their youth. They joked about nearly fooling their own side, or about the artillery that almost silenced them. Behind the laughter was quiet pride. They had seen that war was not only fire and steel, but theater. Their influence stretched far beyond Europe. In the Cold War, deception became doctrine. Inflatable missile sites, staged maneuvers, false radio traffic. The Ghost Army had proved the mind was the most vulnerable target. Armies remembered. Their war was a paradox. They fought by creating what was never there. Their victories left no ruins, no bodies, only confusion in enemy reports. But those confusions saved lives and shortened battles. Memory survives in traces, the roar of tanks that never rolled, bridges that were never built, divisions that never marched. As one veteran said decades later, sitting by a tape machine in his garage, "We fought the war with noise, and sometimes that noise was louder than any gun." Decades later, the secret finally surfaced. By the 1980s, documents long locked in archives were declassified. Journalists uncovered reports of phantom divisions, of units armed with loudspeakers rather than guns. What had once been buried in after-action files emerged as a story in its own right: the Ghost Army. Veterans who had hauled reels and speakers through Normandy and across the Rhine at last began to speak. They recalled nights splicing wire in frozen fields, ducking shells while playing tank engines, laughing when even their own comrades believed the illusion. At first, the public listened with disbelief. Then came admiration. Few had imagined that deception staged with theater and engineering had helped shape victory in Europe. Museums began to collect their tools. Loudspeakers, once caked in mud, now stood behind glass. Primitive wire recorders, each able to hold 20 minutes of sound, were displayed with notes explaining how a single reel could alter a battle. Visitors leaned close, listening to crackling recordings of trucks and tanks, astonished that such ordinary noises had been turned into weapons. Books and documentaries followed. They highlighted not only the ingenuity of the methods, but also the unlikely mixture of men who composed the unit. Artists, actors, sound engineers, radio men, stage designers. It was an army built not for destruction, but for illusion. Their story resonated with a new generation that understood war not only in terms of firepower, but also influence and perception. Recognition came late, but it came. Ceremonies honored the veterans. Families who had never known the truth discovered that their fathers and grandfathers had been part of one of the war's strangest and most creative chapters. "He never spoke about it," one daughter said, "but he fooled the Germans with sound. That was his war." In 2022, the U.S. Congress awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, the nation's highest civilian honor. The legacy continues. Modern militaries still study their work when planning psychological operations. From electronic jamming to cyber deception, the principle endures. What the enemy believes can be as decisive as what the enemy sees. Yet beyond doctrine, the story endures because of its humanity. These men carried no heavy guns. Instead, they saved lives through trickery, reducing the need for costly battles. Their contribution proved that even in total war, imagination could be a weapon. Today, exhibitions let visitors hear those same reels, the thrum of engines, the shouted orders, the endless convoys that never existed. The sounds are faint, almost ghostly, but they carry weight. They are reminders of a war fought not only with steel, but with shadows, a campaign of illusions that helped bring the real one to an end. The soldiers, once dismissed as noisemakers, now stand in history as something greater. Guardians of illusion, masters of sound, and proof that sometimes the loudest weapon on the battlefield is the one that never truly existed.